Good morning, everyone. This meeting is now being broadcast live on the internet.
Welcome, Tom. Can we do a mic check, please?
Yeah, hi.
Great, we
Does
can
that
hear
work?
you. Yes, we can hear you and see you. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Welcome, Marty. Can we do a mic check, please?
Mic check.
Great, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
All right, I will now mute it.
Thank you. Welcome, Supervisor Simidian. I believe you're on mute.
Good morning, Frank. Is that you?
Yes, this is me. I'll be the host clerk today, and Dave will be your actual clerk.
All right. Thank you very much.
Welcome, Aaron. Can we do a mic check, please?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome, Supervisor Lee. Can we do a mic check, please?
Good morning. This is Otto. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Good morning. Thank you very much.
And I to make sure I eliminate my twin here.
I think he's better looking than you are, Otto.
Way better. It's called Photoshop. Good morning, Supervisor Minion. How are you today?
Nice to see you, Otto.
Nice to see you.
Frank, and will you let me know when we're ready to go?
Supervisor Smitty, this is Dave. We are ready to go whenever you are, sir.
Thank you. Why don't you give us a countdown? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are live and we are ready to go.
Thank you. Forgive me. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is the Federal Affairs Advocacy Task Force. It is our regularly scheduled meeting, and it is the first order of business to call the meeting to order and establish the presence of a quorum. And I should just note that newly seated Supervisor Otto Lee is stepping in to fill the seat here on our task force. We welcome him and thank him, and we'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Good morning, Vice Chairperson Lee
Yes.
and Chairperson Simidian.
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. And first item of business after the call to order, of course, is public comment. Public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public on non-agendized items that are properly within the purview of the task force. Do we have anyone lined up under public comment?
We do have one speaker, Mr. Chair.
And let's hear from that speaker, and we'll allow up to 3 minutes under public comment. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Scott Largent. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute. You will have 3 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Scott Largent. Just making sure everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Hold on for just one moment, Scott. I apologize. There we go. Now we have the timer up. Go ahead, Scott, whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds great. Sounds great. Yeah, I kind of noticed it was kind of jamming up there for a second, but it looks like we're working good now. The issue that I wanted to bring up at the Federal Affairs Task Force today was several individuals that I've recently met that served our country and that are pretty much on the streets of Santa Clara County. I'm hoping that, you know, government moves just way too slow. And with these people, they don't have enough time. They need us to step in and get involved. Dante hangs out at the county building. He's an African-American gentleman. He served our country as a child, went through a divorce. I'm slowly figuring out information about this man. The county is limited in a way from calling different departments, even Veterans Affairs, because of HIPAA issues, confidentiality, and I do understand that stuff. But this poor man he needs help. I believe he has PTSD. I know he's a war veteran. I believe he's also a combat war veteran because a lot of stuff kind of shakes him up out there. When you guys were lowering and raising the flags, they were getting caught up in the trees, and you could see him start to go manic. He was wondering, why are they doing this? Why are these flags torn? Stuff like that irritates him. He's been kind of thrown out of the county building. He's been let back in. Why don't we talk with him? Why don't we start doing more? And I don't mind trying to help, but there's professionals that really could help this man. It's very sad. He kind of pops out of bushes over there. He's got all his gear on. It's all his survival gear, but it can scare law enforcement. It can scare staff. If you talk to a lot of people in the county executive's office, they did not know what Dante was all about when he first started showing up. Why don't we do things like that for people that served our country? We can fix that. Now, another story, Johnny, he had surgery at the VA yesterday. Johnny had a broken arm. He was doing side work during tree trimming. Good man, combat war veteran, served our country. Johnny is going to be out on the streets in several days. And I'm amazed that somebody would have surgery and have to go recover in an encampment, in a tent. I don't think that's right. Are there hotel vouchers out there for war veterans? Is there someone else I need to talk to? And I cannot wait the 6 months to a year for government to do something. These seem like situations that you need to act fast. Can you guys help these people? Or do they need to continue to wander your county building? I don't know. Come on, guys. Please, somebody figure something out and give me a call. The number is 408-512-4829. These people deserve better. They're good flag-waving Americans that served our country, and we need to do the right thing. Thank you.
That concludes our speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And that takes us then to item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar and any changes to the task force agenda. Only items on our consent calendar today, Supervisor Lee, are the approval of the minutes and the tentative schedule for meetings in 2021. These are items 10 and 11. I would be pleased to receive a motion from you to approve the consent calendar as contained in our published agenda.
So move, Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor. And I will second the motion. I will check with the clerk to make sure no one is lined up to speak on the consent calendar.
We have no speakers on this item.
And if you would call the roll, please.
Vice Chairperson Lee,
Yes.
Chairperson Simidian.
Simidian and I. Thank you.
Thank you.
Motion approved unanimously. That takes us to the heart of the agenda today. Item 4 is to receive verbal reports from the chairperson and the vice chairperson relating to items of interest in the task force. And again, let me just say, Supervisor Lee, we welcome you to the task force. And today is a day when, rather than having anything that I would characterize as an action item, we really are here to sort of get the lay of the land at a very dynamic time in terms of the situation nationally. So I have nothing else to report, but if you have anything you'd like to share at this time, this is your item.
Thank you, Chair Simidian. First of all, it's truly an honor to be able to serve with you on this task force. Obviously, the federal action is going to be very much needed for our counties, given the budget discussion we have. The CARE funds that we've received early in the year certainly is extremely helpful to help, turn this year's estimated budget to somewhat balanced, right, as we saw yesterday. But right now we certainly do not see any funds coming yet. But from some good news I was reading last night, if that holds true, our Speaker Pelosi and the Senate President McConnell apparently has been meeting yesterday pretty seriously. So hopefully this does become some type of a bill that would generate some of the stimulus money that we've been talking about for so many months. So I do see hope coming through, but I just want to make that mention. Of course, the task force will be tracking very closely any of those development moving forward. Thank you. Chair Smith, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. You would think I would have learned by now. Let me just say to the clerk, without objection and hearing none, we will consider item 4 received. And then that takes us to item 5, which is actually to hear the report from the Office of the County Executive relating to items of interest to the task force. So let me see if we have, I believe Mr. Marquez is on today from the CEO's office, and I don't know if he's going to pass the baton to somebody else, but why don't we go to you, Mr. Marquez? I don't see the county exec on the screen, so let's start with you.
I'm here.
Is on.
Oh, there he is. Forgive me. And Mr. Marquez?
Danielle's going to do the discussion.
That's what I had anticipated. So, all right, we'll turn to Ms. Christensen. Where are you, ma'am?
Okay, sorry, I'm having a challenge with the mute button. Good morning, Danielle Christian, Legislative Manager, and Supervisor Lee, welcome to the county and to the Federal Affairs Advocacy Task Force.
Thank you.
I want to provide a quick disclaimer. I'm on the 11th floor and there's some construction work going on. So you may hear a little bit of rumbling behind me and I apologize for that. The main federal updates on the federal budget and a COVID relief package will be provided under other items on today's agenda, so I'm not going to talk about that right now. As far as some timelines coming up, the Senate is targeting December 18th as its adjournment date. The House is planning to adjourn on the same date, but the House Speaker has stated that it will stay as long as necessary to get a COVID relief package done. And I think we have some good news for you coming up later on in the agenda on that. Looking forward into 2021, the 117th Congress will be sworn into office on January 3rd. It will be in office for the last 2 weeks, the final weeks of Donald Trump's presidency and the first 2 years of Joe Biden's. As I've been communicating with your offices, President-elect Biden has been working to nominate individuals for his cabinet. He made another announcement last night, so he's nominated 9 individuals for cabinet secretary positions. As the remaining 6 nominations are announced, your offices will be notified, and I will also keep you updated once the Senate confirmation process and votes start taking place.
And yeah, can you go through the so-called announced so far? I might miss a couple by now. Do you have them handy?
I'm sorry, Supervisor Lee, you've got a soft voice and I can.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. So do you have those suggested or nominees name handy to just go over real quick?
Sure. Let me pull that up very quickly. Well, I can start with last night. So last night he nominated Peter Buttigieg to be his Secretary of Transportation. And here we go.
Because the earlier word was he was going to go to be ambassador of China, but okay, but that's the latest.
My apologies. I've got my sound turned up as high as I can go, and I'm still not able to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, is this a little better now?
A little bit, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, so for Secretary of Agriculture, he's nominated Mr. Vilsack, who served in that role previously under the Obama administration. For Secretary of Defense, he's nominated General Austin. Health and Human Services, he's nominated our California's Attorney General, Javier Becerra. For Homeland Security, Mr. Mayorkas. And for Housing and Urban Development Secretary,
Fudge.
Congresswoman Fudge from Ohio. For Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, and I can go back and get first names in just a moment for you. For Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, who has had previous leadership roles. And for Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Mr. McDonnell.
Right. No, this is perfect.
I can follow up with a little bit more information to your offices if you would like, their background and their first names.
Great, thank you. This is perfect.
And forgive me, Ms. Christian, this is Supervisor Simidian. I'm not sure if I heard Secretary of Energy for whom the nomination is Jennifer Granholm, yes?
Well, I've been providing information as press releases have been posted to President-elect Biden's website. There have been lots of, I don't know that leaked would be the right word, but there have been lots of early media reports about people who've been under consideration or people who are about to be announced. And I did see something in the news about the individual last night, but as of 9:15 this morning, it wasn't posted on his website yet.
All right, well, we'll hear from others. Anything else you'd like to share at this point, Ms. Christian?
No, thank you, Supervisor.
Thank you. All right, that takes us to item number 6, and without objection, we'll consider the report received on item number 5, hearing none. And Mr. Clerk, you'll let me know if there are speakers along the way on any of these topics. We do want to go to County Council to hear items of interest, legal items of interest to the task force, but specifically including the Serve Justice versus DeVos case. So who will be presenting for County Council?
Good morning. This is Douglas Press, Assistant County Counsel. And again, welcome to Supervisor Lee to this task force. And hello again to Supervisor Simidian. So a few things I wanted to cover today. One was just a few updates to some rather significant cases that we as a county are either involved in or monitoring. And then to address the Serve Justice Title IX and related cases. And then also talk about something I'm captioning as a topic of where do we go from here? So let me first turn to some of the, of course, this is all in the County Council's report that's attached to the agenda if people want to follow along, but just a few cases in particular. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all 90 some odd pages, but the first, of course, is the Affordable Care Act case, California versus Texas. This is the challenge about whether the individual mandate, now that the penalty has been zeroed out, whether the individual mandate is itself unconstitutional, and then frankly more of concern to many states and local governments is whether the notion that if the individual mandate is unconstitutional, is that severable, or does its unconstitutionality bring down the entire Affordable Care Act and all of the other provisions therein? The oral argument, as you may have heard, took place on November 10th last month, literally 1 week after the election. It was a lengthy, more than 2-hour oral argument. I did listen to it. I agree with the many commentators that it sounds like the Supreme Court is a little bit skeptical about taking down the entire Affordable Care Act. And frankly, it's not even clear whether they will even reach the issue of whether the individual mandate is unconstitutional. So it's possible that the ACA may yet survive yet another major Supreme Court challenge, but we'll obviously have to see what the Supreme Court decides. Of course, if it means that even if they do reach the issue of the individual mandate's unconstitutionality, and they also find that that provision is severable, then that would mean that all of the remaining provisions of the Affordable Care Act would still be in effect. Pre-existing condition prohibition, lifetime cap prohibition, healthcare exchanges, and all the rest. So of course we are monitoring that case, as I'm sure many others are, extremely closely. Another matter that was heard recently that we've been involved in are the census cases. A case called New York versus Trump. We filed an amicus brief in this case, and this was where the president, the current president, asked for there to be basically the Secretary of Commerce to include a report to the president, information that would enable the president to identify and then potentially exclude non-citizens or people in the US without, quote unquote, without authorization, and to then exclude those people, or at least make the argument to exclude them from the population count that's used for figuring out how many representatives are to be apportioned in Congress for the various states. So of course, the implications and ramifications of this are tremendous, given that in states that have very large immigrant populations, such as California, if there is some manner to exclude those without arguable authorization from the enumeration, that could literally affect our representation numbers in Congress. And of course, I would imagine there could be other, in addition to political consequences, it's certainly possible that it could be factored into other apportionment issues down the road. Again, the court appeared skeptical of the underlying issue of whether people in the US without authorization, at least large numbers of them, could be excluded. And it looks like, frankly, the justices are looking for reasons to basically punt this case. So again, we'll have to see. This was put on a very fast track. The Supreme Court was advised that it needed an answer by December 31st. And so it gave an accelerated argument schedule. And yet during the oral argument, the federal attorneys conceded that frankly, they were probably not in a position to even develop this report and information and identification of people in the US allegedly without authorization by the end of the month. So obviously more to come on that. And then finally, you may have heard about the public charge rule on December 2nd. Even though the Supreme Court, by some earlier decisions, allowed the public charge rule to go forward in most parts of the nation, on December 2nd, our Ninth Circuit, in a ruling that frankly, through some consolidation, covers 18 states in the District of Columbia, ruled in a 2-1 decision to affirm the preliminary injunction that we were able to secure down below. So the public charge rule is not in effect in the Ninth Circuit and frankly, 18 other states, including the District of Columbia. This just came out again on December 2nd. Obviously, it's fair to assume that the current federal Department of Homeland Security will likely petition for certiorari before the US Supreme Court, but of course, with a change of administration, that could very well either not happen or be recalled or changed. So that's just matters from the chart generally I wanted to highlight. Now to turn to the Serve Justice versus DeVos Title IX cases. So just to give you an update, that remember Serve Justice was a challenge to 2017 guidance that the federal Department of Education put out that fundamentally changed longstanding rules and practices about Title IX investigations. But it itself was not a rule promulgated pursuant to the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. So while that 2017 guidance was being challenged in the Serve Justice versus DeVos case, the federal government did, in fact, through the Department of Education, go through formal rulemaking and ultimately promulgate a final rule to implement many of the same, what I would contend is very, very harmful provisions of the 2017 guidance, only now in federal rule, arguably making the Serve Justice case moot. So going back to Serve Justice, the court there dismissed the case below. That's now on appeal, but the appeal to the Ninth Circuit is itself stayed pending action on lawsuits challenging the actual federal rule that was promulgated, which I will turn to in a second. Bottom line is, the Ninth Circuit Serve Justice appeal was stayed until November 4th, and then the litigants in that case secured another extension of the stay that lasts until January 4th. I guess they're doing it in 60-day increments, but the last order from the court extending the stay of Serve Justice, the Serve Justice appeal until January 4th, says if you need more time or you think the stay should be extended, come back. And the inference is the court will probably grant it. Obviously, with a change of administration, the court wants to see what's going to happen. So the other Title IX cases that are cases that actually challenge the Title IX final rule itself, Know Your Nine versus DeVos and New York versus US Department of Education, both those cases have run their course. The two active cases are the Pennsylvania versus DeVos case. This is the case where the state of California is a part. That case is going through just a lot of kind of procedural steps. An amended complaint was filed. There's now a motion for summary judgment pending on that new complaint. Briefing is going to be occurring in the first quarter of 2021. So again, we're not going to have a decision on that case for a while. And then there's another case called Victim Rights Law Center versus DeVos. This is out of the District Court of Massachusetts. They moved for a preliminary injunction against the new federal rule, but the court there said, well, I'm going to combine your request for a preliminary injunction with the trial itself. The trial was supposed to have been held on November 18th, and quite frankly, I've been trying to get some detail, even contacting the attorneys on the case about what exactly happened on November 18th, because it looks like now a second amended complaint in that lawsuit has been filed. So it's a little bit unclear whether we're actually going to get a conclusive decision out of that case. So after all that procedural gobbledygook, where does that leave us? And where that leaves us, I think, is that, quite frankly, a lot of folks would like to know, what does the new incoming administration plan to do with the rule, and what can they do, and how long will it take, and relatedly, what should the courts do in the meantime? So that then takes me to part 3 of my little presentation here, which I'm calling "Where do we go from here?" So if you look at our lengthy report from the County Counsel's office that's attached to the board agenda, you probably have noticed that most of the matters that we are following, either because we as a county are involved in the cases or that we are monitoring them, they involve some type of executive action. So there are certainly the executive order cases, and then there are the federal guidance cases like serve justice. There are federal rules cases, meaning they're lawsuits about rules promulgated by the Trump administration. And then quite frankly, there are very few, and then there are other federal actions like the census case involving other types of executive activity. But there are very few that involve actual statutory challenges. So what this means is that for the bulk of the items that we are following that are listed on the task force list are items that a new incoming administration, the Biden administration, will likely be able to weigh in on, and probably will. The problem, though, is that some of these can take a great deal of time. Certainly for executive orders, depending on what's involved, some of those probably could be repealed, reversed, rescinded relatively quickly, one executive order undoing another. It becomes a little bit more complicated, and this cross-references a question, Supervisor Simitian, that you had asked at the last meeting, which is that for all of our federal rules cases, one cannot simply say, well, a new incoming administration is here, and we've decided that we're just going to repeal all the rules. It's just not that simple. Quite frankly, to repeal a rule, to alter or amend or modify a rule, you have to go through the entire rulemaking process. So sort of a great unwinding, but by the same APA processes. So that means you have to have, notice and comment of the new proposed rule as repealed. You have to have an adequate justification. Public hearings often go along with that. And then, of course, the inevitable legal challenges that follow that assert that the repeal of the rule did not follow the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. And frankly, even today, there are a number of rules that the Trump administration has been trying to repeal from the Obama era that are also being subject to APA challenges and that we are following. So I did note that I think it was a couple of board meetings ago, you did authorize a resolution to extend the life of this task force by a year. And I would imagine we're definitely going to use this year to follow, or the coming year, to follow all of these matters as the Biden and Harris administration figure out how, and frankly, how speedily they can repeal and or alter some of these rules that we are interested in and following. So I will cease speaking for the moment unless you have any questions.
Thank you. Before I turn to Supervisor Lee, let me just follow up, Mr. Press. So to the extent that we have rules that have already been litigated or upheld, does that suggest that next steps are likely to be the extended unwinding that you described through the rulemaking process, or is it possible that there would be federal legislation in the field, or that the push and shove continues in the courts? So I can see those three different arenas.
Yes. So all three branches of the federal government, of course, have a say and have a role, if you will, in the fate of the regulations, any regulation. Obviously, as our lengthy list demonstrates, the courts have a pretty substantial role to play by way of hearing lawsuits, deciding lawsuits, typically arguments that the rule was in some fashion not promulgated in accordance with the Federal Administrative Procedures Act, or in some other way conflicts with the enabling law, i.e. the law that was enacted by Congress that gave authority to even enact rules in the first place. And similarly, Congress can also change law, change the enabling law, frankly, overrule a rule by new statute. But of course, that's much more complicated given that we have what might very well be a divided Congress. Obviously, we won't know that till next month. But yes, so every branch has a role, every branch can do something. But of course, it's, as we saw from the Trump administration, it's more likely to get most of the activity emanating from the executive branch, since, at least to initiate, repeal, alter, or modification of a rule, you don't need permission of any other branch to at least start that.
All right. Supervisor Lee, any comments or questions on this item?
Yes, Chair, thank you so much. By the way, first of all, I would say that was a very good detailed report, Mr. Press. I really appreciate it because I think many of us who are not as intimate on these issues have the misconception thinking that, okay, now with a new administration, then all these things would change relatively quickly. With the first day of the executive order coming from the new president, but clearly it's not that simple. So in terms of the executive orders, let me break down the differences. So the census, the public charge, a lot of those looks like are from executive orders. So because of that, those actually could be repealed far quicker, right?
Well, the public charge rule is a rule.
Oh, that's a rule. I'm sorry. That's...
Yeah. And just also one other comment about executive orders. There is something that, quite frankly, is almost a presidential tradition. I think this started with, certainly picked up steam with Reagan, and I know that Obama, I think, did it as well. And that is that when there's a new incoming administration, by way of executive order or other executive action, the new administration will often say, number one, we're putting a moratorium on any regulations that are currently in development, and also to kick out the effective date of any rules that have gone through the process but have not yet formally become effective by way of reaching their effective date. So I'm not aware of any in particular that we are following just yet that fall into that latter category, but that is something that I would highly expect to see among the first things that the Biden-Harris administration will do in the relatively early going. Just in other words, to give themselves a little space to see what's in the pipeline, if you will, from a regulatory perspective. But yes, but other executive orders, there's always complications, but I would say in the main, an executive order can undo an executive order.
Right, right. So in terms of affecting St. Clair County more specifically, which do you think will be executive orders that would be most likely to be overturned? Obviously, I'm not asking every single one you can remember, but just looking at you've gave us a very, by the way, there's a very lengthy litigation update of like 96 pages of it with so many different type of cases. Like, for example, like census, right? This was not a rule, correct? This was more of an executive order?
The census was, I put that in the category of other executive action, in the sense that some of the things that we are challenging are that, that Trump wanted this memorandum, if you will, that provided information that the litigants in the case were arguing was frankly irrelevant and prejudicial for the Secretary of Commerce to produce. So that might be something. I'd have to sort of take a closer look at the actual vehicle that the president was trying to use to accomplish this. But assuming it's more of the executive order variety, that's something that the incoming administration could change, I would imagine, relatively quickly.
Right. And some of these, the courts have already ruled on, for example, like the issue on the trying to stop funding to century counties. Of course, that would affect us directly, and I believe the court already ruled on that one, right?
Mm-hmm.
The public, you mentioned the public charge already, right? But so there's a few issues that will relate to. So I guess my concern is, well, I guess not concern. I guess my thinking is that there probably will, assuming that a lot of these things will be changed, most of these suits would become moot or be dismissed by the new administration, so that maybe we could focus our efforts into fewer cases.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. One is that some of them will become sort of moot by action, in the sense that the current client, if you will, the current federal administration will now be a different client in a little over a month. And so, quite frankly, the attorneys walking into court on behalf of the federal government will very likely be making different arguments, changing arguments, withdrawing arguments. So that's going to impact litigation. Certainly, if executive orders are withdrawn, if rules are repealed through the rulemaking process, yes, some of these are very likely to become moot. Obviously, hard to imagine what the list might look like a year from now. I imagine there's going to be less federal litigation, but one doesn't know, of course. But certainly, I would imagine, there's still going to be lots of amicus work going out there, because we also have fundamentally a different Supreme Court, of course, that looks very different than it did just a few months ago.
Right. No, thank you very much for the good update. So we can't wait till up to January 21st, when the whole set of new executive orders will be coming from day one, from what I heard. So it'll certainly be an interesting.
Yeah, I imagine we're going to have to do a pretty substantial update of the report
Exactly.
in the coming months.
Great. Thank you very much, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor Lee. Let me just check with the clerk to see if we have any comments from members of the public on this item.
No public speakers, sir.
Thank you. Then, Mr. Press, what I will do is I will say thank you, and if you can please keep us abreast of these issues as we go through the coming weeks and months, that would be appreciated. And again, I'll say without objection, and hearing none, we will consider the report received. All right. That takes us then to item number 7, which is the report from the Office of the County Council relating to the fiscal year, federal budget and appropriations process. I'm going to guess, and I may be corrected here, that if I went to Dr. Smith, he'd turn to Ms. Christian, and that if I turned to Ms. Christian, she'd turn to the folks at Prime. Ms. Christian, how'd I do?
You are 100% correct.
Okay, then let's go. That may be the only time I hear that all day. So thank you for that, Ms. Christian. Let me turn to the folks at Prime. I see that Ms. Dorton's on the screen for us, and welcome. And what can you share with us about the state of our budget at the national level?
So good morning. So what I can share is not a lot, but we can get into a little bit of state of play at this point. So as you may be aware, yesterday, Speaker Pelosi arranged a Four Corners meeting late in the day with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, as well as House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, to finalize government funding for FY21 and COVID relief. The meeting was also reportedly joined by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. As of this morning, negotiations are still ongoing on Capitol Hill related to the ultimate package, which we assume will include omnibus spending for FY21, health extenders, tax extenders, COVID relief, and potentially surprise billing, among a few other things. Quick side note, the bills are being packaged together into one, both in the interest of time and also to require only one presidential signature. My intention this morning was to report on the county's priorities within the spending bills for FY21 and highlight any program or programs which could see a significant change in funding from last fiscal year to this fiscal year. While we are told that a deal has been reached on spending, we have yet to see those details and any specifics. So what I will do is I'll be happy to provide detail and summary in the next few days as text becomes available, and I can give you any specifics on programs that the county is watching. In the meantime, with respect to the rest of the package that is expected to be announced, my colleagues, as well as I know Mr. Margolin, will cover the pertinent pieces of the package under separate items during this meeting. So that's all I have for this one for the moment, because we don't have a final bill that we are able to share.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. And let me just say before I turn to Supervisor Lee, and this will apply on to a number of circumstances, situations, issues that arise. We are in an unusual budget year ourselves here at the county. And for those of us who had gotten accustomed to what we thought was an annual exercise with workshops and hearings in May and June for our fiscal year, which, as you will recall, is a July 1 start, we had grown accustomed to some uncertainty, but given the relatively manageable budget situation we were in, we could make that work from year to year. This year at the county, we have had a what I'll call a rolling series of budget hearings, actions, because we're in very uncertain times, not just with respect to the federal budget situation, but the state budget situation, certain determinations about our own local funding, everything from property tax receipts being uncertain this year, given the economy, to what's known as ERAF funding, Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund, all of which is by way of preface to saying, as we make these hard choices, we're trying to assess how bad is it, and that's tougher to assess when we have even greater uncertainty. So if we could revisit for just a moment with you the timeline question. Let me try it this way. What do we think we're going to know 2 or 3 days from now that we don't know already? And or what's your sense of timeline on this? Is this really about to break and it just happens that we're a day or two early to understand what's happening? Or could we be having the same conversation when we talk to you in January?
So what I will say, and I will have my colleagues weigh in if they have other views or have anything to add. But what I will say is it seems to be changing by the minute, whereas a day ago, the word was they were going to potentially have another continuing resolution for another week to make a decision by next week. But then I think it was early this morning, we heard that no, the deal is done and they'll see it, and I'll use air quotes, in the next day. I think that really means, and I know my colleagues can speak to specific timing because of floor procedure, but ultimately over the next couple of days, that maybe Friday in the House and then this weekend in the Senate. I know there's specific rules about that, and but I think that's what we're thinking of, and that's. But I believe, though, that we should see something by the end of this weekend. I don't know if, see something passed by the end of this weekend. And Marty, I don't know if that makes sense with you as far as timing, but I know we heard from someone in the House that they're saying, it's imminent, but that it probably would, when faced with the reality of actually getting the text done and getting it rolled out, it really means Friday.
I would be pleased to hear from your colleagues if they have anything else they think would be helpful to share.
No, I think Aaron, and sorry, this is Elizabeth Hart Thompson. For some reason, it looks as if there are two Aarons. This is actually
My twin.
Thompson. And I saw Rich popped on the screen, so he may want to add something, but I think Aaron did a great job summarizing. It does appear that in theory, there is a deal between the four corners. There are some sort of nits and gnats that are hanging out there that still need to be resolved, and some open questions about putting aside the omnibus and putting aside the negotiations on the COVID package, but some other pieces of legislation that may accompany, such as surprise medical bill, some USMCA technical corrections, a few other things that are still being negotiated. But like Aaron said, it looks like at this point, they're just waiting on sort of the technical aspect, which can take longer than expected, which is the drafting and the manufacturing of the legislative text.
And the COVID package, which you referenced in passing, is the timing on that as of today's expectation is what again?
It's all the same. They're only going to take one vote. And so the omnibus appears to have been more or less ready as of yesterday. No one has seen any text on any of this, by the way, but that a deal was reached in theory, 24, 48 hours ago. But they have been working on the final details on the, coronavirus stimulus, whatever you want to call it, package, because they're going to bring them together through the rules process so that they can, obviate the need for more than one presidential signature.
Thank you. Mr. Mead, anything else you want to add before I turn to our county executive, Dr. Smith, which I will do in a moment?
Just to add a little, another layer, some more context to it. We are anticipating that the omnibus appropriations bill will roughly match what the House passed appropriations bills were in terms of overall funding, minus some of the emergency supplemental funding they put on for COVID response. So the figure should turn out roughly where they were for the House passed bills for your priorities, number one. Number two, the COVID package that they're talking about looks to be about a $900 billion package in total. There's not a lot of specifics about how much for this priority versus that priority, but in total, it should be about $900 billion.
And Mr. Mead, I know you just told us there's not a lot of specifics about the COVID package, but one of the things that you all can imagine we've been concerned about here at the county is the back and forth about whether or not there would be funding for state and local governments as part of a package. Any update on that particular piece of the conversation?
It appears as though both the state and local funding component and the liability for businesses are both being jettisoned for further discussion next year.
All right. Dr. Smith, any thoughts about how all of this affects the way we go about doing our work? If not, but if so, it would be helpful to hear it.
Well, Mr. President, I just reemphasize the last comment made that the appearance that there's going to be a delay in any particular specific aid to local government is a huge problem for the county locally. As you well know, and the public knows, the first CARES Act money has already been spent quite some time ago, and we're generating significant expenditures every week. If there's much more delay, we'll have to start reducing even more than we're already planning to reduce in February. So it's a critical issue. And at this point, as the specialist from Prime pointed out, it's anybody's guess exactly what's happening in the sausage making.
Thank you. And Dr. Smith, and if you could take just a moment, in part because I'd like our representatives at the national level to sort of understand the implications of this in terms of our own budget making decision, just to sort of round out a little bit. There their understanding. I know they have clients from around the country, but to sort of understand what the implications of this are, so that as they're talking with folks in Washington, D.C., they understand how this plays out back in the States and on the ground. So absent some understanding or commitment of additional funding between now and, potentially end of January, what does that mean for our county? That means we will have to do what, or not be able to do what?
Well, our COVID response locally here has been multifaceted and quite expensive. And obviously, we're not going to stop the response. That includes testing, tracing, all of the associated healthcare that is required, plus all of the administrative structure to actually provide services. It's also been challenging to keep the current operations of the county functional during a time period where many of our employees are at home or on leave or ill. So multiple impacts, and the cost is accelerating to the tune of $18 million a week. So obviously, if that continues, we'll have to ask the board to make some very challenging priority decisions, because we really can't stop the COVID response. But if we don't have any reimbursement from it, we're relying upon the general fund, which is already at risk. So we could easily find ourselves in a much more challenging financial situation than we're already presuming, which is that we're going to end up with a $200 million ongoing structural deficit for next fiscal year, with about $100 million in this fiscal year to fix in mid-year. So it's a huge deal for us. Obviously, it's true for every local jurisdiction, but because we have a large health system and we're particularly involved in the COVID response, it magnifies the effect.
All right, thank you for that. So just before I turn to Supervisor Lee next, for the team from Prime, if I were going to grossly oversimplify and try and bottom line all this, it sounds like the short version is we'll know a whole lot more by Monday or Tuesday of next week than we do today, just by virtue of the current dynamics. And if we had $5 in the office pool, we wouldn't bet on any state or local money being in the package that's passed in the next few days. Ms. Dorton, Mr. Mead, does that sound more or less?
I think we're going to know more, and I think we're going to know more by tomorrow morning as far as the package, but state and local and liability, I think that's accurate.
And I would just also add though, that the delegation is well aware of the county's position, and they have been working round the clock to communicate this, and the speaker is well aware, and they're all on the same page. But this seems to be, just such a bigger stumbling block in the overall process of getting this whole quite large package done by the end of the year, that the expectation is that it's kicked to next year, because it's just a major sticking point. But I will say, though, that your delegation is very, very aware.
All right. Mr. Mead, anything else?
The only thing I'll add, that although the state and local funding will not likely be part of this package, there may be some provisions of the stimulus bill that the county can benefit from. For example, they are expected to include some more provider relief funds that the hospital may qualify for. So there may be some smaller pieces of funding that could be available to the county.
All right, thank you for that. And Ms. Hart-Thompson, forgive me, I didn't mean to overlook you a moment ago. I'm just dealing with the multiplicity of screens and names. So thank you for chiming in. Supervisor Otto Lee, let me introduce you to our team at Prime Policy and see if you have any questions or comments at this time.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to dial back a little bit on the introduction first. So I see a bunch of names on Zoom, so I apologize if I get your name wrong. I see Aaron Graff. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Hello. Rich Mead. Right. Hi.
Hello.
You mentioned Hart Thompson.
Hi. Yep.
Hi. I can see your face, but I see your box there. So you're the firm representing.
Hi there.
Oh, hello.
There
Hi,
we are.
Amber. Hello. Good to see you.
Hi.
Hi. So you're representing us in our county in Washington D.C. on the federal issues, right? Okay. Good. Thank you. I just want to get that intro in to clarify. Thank you so much. Couple of questions regarding the relief we are doing here. So if I recall back in March and April, one of the big things that passes Congress on relief funds has to do with one was sending checks to individuals, right? Like the $1,200 check. I see some proposal people talking about $2,000 checks. And from what I've read is that none of this seems to be in this latest $900 billion stimulus package. Am I correct?
No, we actually think that when they dropped the state and local and liability piece, that they have repurposed that funding for direct payments, although much smaller, probably in the range of $600 to $700.
Okay, so you think that actually might be the direct payment after all the people's wanting it. Okay, so that might be what happened. Got it. All right. So second question I have is regarding I remember reading something about there was a lot of corporate debt or corporate bond that was purchased from the federal government first time around to stimulate the economy. Is there such thing in this stimulus package or any word of that?
So there's a liquidity facility that got stood up at the Federal Reserve Bank.
Right.
Yeah, and there's nothing of that magnitude in this package, although we believe there are going to be provisions that will extend the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses. That should be in the package.
Okay. Now, as we know, the PPP came out in different cycles, right? So the first round, they ran out of money, right? So they appropriate a little bit more. And the second round, apparently, they actually wasn't able to spend at all, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
Am I correct? Yeah. So when you say extend the PPP, are they going to allow new companies to apply for PPP? Or is it more of a way for the companies who got the first round to come up with applying again second round?
And again, we'll see the specifics shortly, but our understanding is that the provisions will likely allow for small businesses to get a second round. So for those who did it from the first program, they can go back and reapply for additional monies.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much on that. As you know, our small businesses certainly has been hurting very significantly, and we try our best local-wise in county to help them out in some potential loans. And then the other thing I was going to ask was regarding the maybe less related to us about the NDAA. So the NDAA apparently has passed with something like a veto-proof majority, but I don't think that necessarily affect us very much, but that would probably be vetoed and just kind of go through the process. And assuming that's the case, all that would be rolled out by approval by sometime in January?
I'll take this one, Rich. This is Marty Paoni,
Hi.
also with Prime Policy. And you're correct that the DOD bill did pass. It was presented to the president on December 11th.
Mm-hmm.
He has 10 days in which to veto it or sign it from that date starting on the 12th. You don't count that day, which gives you, if you did, and you don't count Sundays, which gives you till December 23rd, midnight. And so if he vetoes it, then he sends it back. And then the House, it started out in the House. The House would have the first bite of the apple to override the veto. It's a House number bill. And they would probably do it, my guess is after Christmas, maybe before, the week after Christmas, before New Year's. But in any case, they would get it done before January 3rd.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you.
And then it would go to the Senate. The Senate would also have their vote.
Right. Great. Thank you. Thank you for the civics lesson on how our, I'm only a bill, right?
Yeah, just a bill.
Yes, I know my daughters were learning that song, so watching those videos. So remind me how the process works. So thanks for the second lesson there. Okay, but I think, yeah, thank you so much for the great update. I think it's really interesting to see that the federal government, this stimulus package is coming through. Certainly, we don't have a whole lot of details, but hopefully by tomorrow we'll be able to get that. And I don't know, I know we won't be probably meeting till sometime in February, but certainly any type of update you could provide us before then, it would be really, really appreciated. So we could help out our own planning locally, since the funding is so tight for us at this point. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Supervisor Lee. And just a couple quick observations before we move on.
Mr. Chair, my apologies, sir. I don't mean to interrupt, but we have a second individual signed in as Supervisor Lee, so I need that individual to either identify themselves or I'm going to have to remove them from the room for security purposes.
Okay. Supervisor Lee, are you double dipping on us today in the best of ways, or do we need?
I told you I have a twin. I'm sorry. I think I have asked one of my policy support on. Is Elika, are you on?
Yes, it's me, Otto.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, she's good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Chair.
No, of course. And my name is Elika for reference. I just can't change it here because I'm using Otto's link.
Okay, we'll going forward, we'll make sure that we send individual links to staff members.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you again. We've covered a lot of ground here. Appreciate that. Some of this is going to make item number 9 go relatively quickly because we covered a lot of the COVID relief conversation here. Forgive me if I just couldn't wait till we get to that item and wanted to integrate it all. Thank you to the entire team from Prime for sharing their insights and their thoughts as well. I don't think I have anything else under item number 7 with respect to budget and appropriations process. I will, however, Ms. Christian, ask if you could perhaps share with us a written off-agenda report about where we stand on these items sometime in the next week or two after the action that we are expecting the Congress to take. And when the situation becomes a little clearer, passing along a summary from Prime and or your office that just says, all right, the dust has settled, at least for the moment. Here's where we are. Is that something we could ask you for, Ms. Christian?
Yes, it'd be my pleasure to provide that.
Thank you. And then Supervisor Lee correctly noted that we're not under our tentative scheduled to have another meeting of the task force until first week of February. My office will work with yours, Ms. Christian, to see if we need to either schedule a brief meeting in January or again, use an off-agenda memo, because if things are developing then, we're going to want to be mindful of that as we go through this rolling budget exercise at the county that I've described previously. All right, thank you very much. And why don't we then segue to item number 8 without objection. We'll consider the report received on item number 7. I don't believe the clerk has anyone teed up to speak on item number 7. Mr. Clerk, want to make sure that's correct?
That's correct, sir. There are no speakers.
Thank you. So that takes us to item number 8. And item number 8, same team plus our colleague, Mr. Margolin, who will help us with some of the healthcare issues as well, supplementing what we'll hear otherwise. But this is the time when we turn back to you, Ms. Christian, and the team from Prime and from Mr. Margolin's office to talk about the federal legislative and regulatory and administrative climate following the election. I think when we had this scheduled, we thought that all of this might be a little clearer with respect to the Senate in particular. But why don't we just ask the folks at Prime to begin, if that's how you'd like to proceed, Ms. Christian?
That would be good.
All right.
Great. Again, this is Elizabeth Hart Thompson. And I'm going to go ahead and give an overview, and then we'll have Rich and Marty weigh in. I, of course, am putting healthcare items to the side so that Mr. Margolin can speak about those whenever we get there. So not surprisingly, we expect a very different federal regulatory and administrative environment as we look to the incoming Biden-Harris administration. I'm going to spend a few minutes outlining what we believe their priorities will be, and then I'll briefly discuss sort of the congressional outlook. As far as the Biden administration, I think their number one focus, obviously, will be a national strategy to combat the pandemic, likely to include enhanced, free, and improved COVID testing, boosting of US medical equipment manufacturing, and perhaps most importantly, overseeing the massive logistics and the operation of nationwide vaccine distribution and ensuring that it is equitable. We also expect to see a lot of economic revitalization packages focusing on additional coronavirus relief. We've already kind of covered this ground, but in addition to the package that we expect to be passed by Congress later this week, particularly since state and local aid and liability were left out of the package, that certainly leaves an opening for Congress to come back to these things in the 117th. We certainly expect to see the Biden administration prioritize infrastructure as part of its overall economic plan. Excuse me. We expect to see a package, an infrastructure and clean energy package upwards of $2 trillion. Such package might include modernizing electric grid infrastructure for increased clean power generation to achieve carbon pollution-free power, repairing roads and bridges, investing in our transportation infrastructure, including public transit, airports, railways, retrofitting and upgrading buildings, schools, encouraging homes to become more energy efficient, and reauthorizing expiring surface transportation programs, probably the starting point being something like the House passed Moving Forward Act, which was HR 2. That legislation, as you may recall, included massive investments in roads, bridges, broadband, Amtrak, alternative fuel, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. President-elect Biden has stated repeatedly that climate change will be front and center the next 4 years. It is expected that he will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. Immigration, he has promised a substantial set of immigration reforms, and I'll detail those more momentarily when I talk a little bit more about executive action and executive orders. And also, I think that we really, we certainly expect, whether you want to call it or whether it's police reform focused or more of criminal justice reform, but that will be front and center for this administration. So executive action detail, while the more immediate issues is the pandemic, the economy, and like I said, maybe police reform, criminal justice reform, will drive the incoming administration's legislative priorities at the outset. President Biden has pledged to roll back many of President Trump's most controversial actions, predominantly through the use of executive order. So I'll just run through a couple of those buckets. On immigration, we expect to see Biden to get rid of policies that have been detrimental to seeking asylum, such as the policy to make asylum seekers wait in Mexico for hearings in U.S. Immigration Court, reverse Trump's public charge rule, fully reinstate the DACA program, repeal the travel ban on people visiting the United States from 13 countries, many of them Muslim majority. We expect him to order an immediate review of temporary protected status. On education, we expect executive action on equitable treatment of DACA students so that they can receive assistance, eliminate limits on international student visas, reinstate gainful employment rules and borrower defense rules, enforce student civil rights rules. On food and agriculture, reverse nutrition and feeding program actions, limiting SNAP, such as the able-bodied adult without dependence rule, expanding and utilizing flexibilities for food programs related to COVID, in the pandemic, reprioritize, reallocate, and support USDA research agencies such as the Economic Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. I will briefly now just talk a little bit about what we can sort of expect in the first 100 days. I'm going to talk a little bit more. Actually, I'm going to talk a lot more about the House since that's my area of expertise. And then I'll turn it over to Rich to add on, and then certainly to Marty, who I don't think there's anyone who knows more about the Senate than Marty to add his 2 cents. But during the first 100 days in the House is actually planning on spending most of its time on the same message bills that saw floor time in the first quarter of the 116th Congress. We expect that HR 1, which was, For the People Act, which was a sunshine in government voter rights package, to again be the first bill that hits the floor. Actually, excuse me, the voting rights package, HR 4, is likely to be the second bill that moves to the floor. And then we expect to see the police reform package also see priority consideration. In the House, the goal is to try to use time to let the administration get as many of their nominees confirmed, their political appointments made, and for the House to sort of message and demonstrate broad support within the caucus, and sort of set out a marker on a lot of issues that they'll dive deeper on as the Congress unfolds. Part of the other first 100 days agenda will include sort of infrastructure, drug costs, as I mentioned, voting rights, Equality Act, DACA Dreamers, paycheck fairness, background check, and likely climate legislation. As we all know, we won't know the fate of the Senate until after the Georgia runoffs. Republicans are, I think, widely expected to maintain control of the Senate, albeit narrow control. It's really important to note that there are 2 House races that have yet to be called. But ultimately, Democrats are expected to have a mere 5-seat majority in the House. And I'm happy, maybe I'll stop here so we can, if anyone is interested in sort of having a more nuanced conversation about what governing is going to be like in the next Congress. But, in summary, consensus will be difficult to achieve. And I think it's probably fair to say that passing, transformational policies will also be an uphill climb. Marty, do you want to add a little bit about the Senate usually takes longer to get organized, and I don't know how much the outcome of the Georgia runoffs will affect that even further. So I'm going to pause there.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth noted, we're awaiting the results of the January 5th Georgia runoffs. The problem with this is they come in on January 3rd, and at that time, you'll still have McConnell as majority leader. Pence will still be the vice president. Should lightning strike and the Democrats take both those seats, then it's a 50-50 Senate. And then when Harris gets inaugurated on January 20th, Schumer would become majority leader by dint of Harris being vice president. This would be a mirror repeat of 2001, when Florida was decided by the Supreme Court, giving Bush the White House, meaning Lieberman, Gore's vice president candidate, was still going to be a senator, and we had 50-50 then. And what you had was Democrats were in the majority from the beginning of the Congress until the inauguration, and they processed Bush's nominations. And so that on Inauguration Day, they were able to confirm 5 of his cabinet people. They would expect the same from McConnell's committee chairman, at least in the committees where they still have chairman. And I say that because as a result of retirements, there are a number of committees that do not have chairman yet. They do an organizing resolution at the beginning of each Congress, moving senators around into new committee assignments, assigning committee assignments to new members. and replacing people that have lost or been or retired. In this case, you've got Alexander of Tennessee, Republican chairman of HELP, is retired. That committee has no longer has a chairman if they keep the majority. Same thing with Enzi at the budget committee. He retired. And Roberts, an agriculture committee, he retired. So those three, they need to do an organizing resolution. Those would be the chairman, Republican chairman. Yes.
Mr. County, excuse the interruption. I apologize. I'm just not understanding. I don't want to make sure. When you say these are folks who have retired,
Yes.
Presumably that means they are retiring at the end of this term. Is that?
Yes.
And I don't mean to sound harsh, but and notwithstanding the fact that they're still members of the United States Senate, or are they not still members of the United States Senate?
On January 3rd, they will no longer be members of the United States
Right.
Senate.
Okay. So I see. So your point is that as of the 3rd of January, those committees are prior to a reorganization without a chair.
Correct.
Thank you. Forgive me. I just didn't understand the timing of the process.
Oh, no problem. Believe me, there are senators up there that don't understand this process. Believe me.
All right.
So as a result, they have to do an organizing resolution, and they themselves will have to wait for the outcome of the elections. I mean, the new Senate convenes on January 3rd. The election's not till the 5th. Might take a couple of days with mail-in ballots, who knows? Or if there are some close, counties to count their votes, it might take them a while to figure out how they went, so that will slow down acting on the organizing resolution, and as a result, it'll slow down them knowing who's in the majority going forward once the inauguration happens on the 20th. They would still be in the majority. McConnell would still be majority leader, but those three committees, for instance, would not have chairman until an organizing resolution has replaced them. And should, like I said, Democrats, get both of those seats, then on the organizing resolution would stipulate, and they would probably just, my guess is the easiest thing for them to do would be to replicate what the Senate did in 2001. At that point, Daschle said, well, we have 50 members. We want equal number of representation on each committee. The Republicans said, well, we're in the majority though with Cheney. We can't govern if bills die on a tie vote in committee. And that was a valid point. Daschle responded and pointed out that Cheney does not get to vote in committee. And so there is a motion to discharge legislation. It's usually not used because it's subject to filibuster, 60 votes. So it's not very useful. What Daschle offered that year was, if any bill does not get reported on a tie vote because of these numbers, then the motion to discharge will have a time limit of 4 hours, equally divided, and then you'll vote. So on any bill that loses on a tie vote, you can have 4 hours of debate and a vote on the Senate floor, and then the vice president can cast his vote. And you could then report your bill. That broke the logjam. They organized, they did equal numbers. They get a 10% bump up for the majority because they have housekeeping matters that they're responsible for in running a committee. And then they were able to go forward. And I would expect a similar arrangement if this were to happen. I think I'm a Democrat, and I say my prayers every night too, but I'd be surprised if this does happen. I think more likely that maybe we could pick off one of those two seats, but and McConnell will probably still be the majority leader, and it'll be easier for them to organize, but time will tell.
Thank you. Any other comment for Primer? Would this be a good opportunity for me to lean in with a question or a comment or two?
Please go ahead with your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And to Elizabeth Hart Thompson, let me just say thank you. Very, very helpful sort of context setting. Ms. Hart Thompson, just a couple of things I wanted to ask for your firm's help with as we go forward, because I'm not sure if we've had, you may recall, well, let me start with infrastructure. Forgive me, I'm trying to collect my thoughts here. On infrastructure issues, both a question and a comment. The question is, it seems like we talk about infrastructure a lot, but never end up with an infrastructure deal. So, well, and I mean, and everybody says, oh, the one thing we can all agree on is infrastructure. And yet we don't seem to get to an agreement. I understand, or I think I understand, that a large part of that is about how do you pay for it. And there are different points of view on that. But I guess I would like your firm's take on, is that, do we think that's really a possibility, or are we likely to run into the same impediments we've run into before? Two areas that you mentioned that I'd just like to ask our team at the county and your team at Prime to keep my office and me informed about, or share with other members of the board as interested. One is the investment in the electrical grid. I'm not sure any of you have any reason to know that I was the author of the Renewable Portfolio Standard legislation in California, 20% by 2010 and 33% by 2020. And one of the impediments that we confronted was folks who were responsible for the grid at CalISO, the independent system operators, were constantly anxious about whether or not the grid that they had could manage the challenges of renewable energy. So I have some legislative history and interest in these grid issues that might not be readily apparent, obvious, or even shared by some of my colleagues, but I would like to be kept informed on those developments. Not anything special, just sort of something you might ordinarily leave out of a report. I'm suggesting if we could make sure we're the beneficiaries of your knowledge, that would be great. The other one is, you mentioned rail, and some members of your firm will recall that high-speed rail has a particular history here in California. Again, a subject of particular interest to me. The efforts in California have been challenged. That will be my euphemism of the day. But I'm just curious about any activity that would have an impact on high-speed rail here in California, in part because there's a very direct Santa Clara County connection in terms of what does or doesn't happen in the years ahead. So with those two requests about high-speed rail and the grid, let me go back to my question, which was any thoughts about whether or not we're going to get beyond having the theoretical conversation about infrastructure, and whether or not you think there's potential as things are shaping up for that to be real in the next 4 years.
I'm going to actually I'm going to say two things, then I'm going to ask Rich to take over on this one, probably with a little bit longer of an institutional knowledge and history on having sort of watched this history unfold. I think definitely the issue with infrastructure about how it gets paid for, but I think that one of the big challenges with infrastructure is that it truly means something different to every single member of Congress. And so it can be hard to get consensus on what the world, putting aside even how you pay for it, sort of what is the realm of possible. Rich, do you want to talk? And I should say too, as I mentioned, I do think that I do think ultimately getting a huge transformational infrastructure package is difficult for the reasons that I sort of talked about and Marty just sort of talked about, which is how narrowly divided the Congress is. But at the same time, I think always, and it's to be determined past the degree to which this administration will have to make the pandemic a priority, but where do they really want to spend their political capital as far as a legacy achievement? And I think that is a little bit of an open question. And as long as that is a little bit of an open question, the idea of infrastructure is less far of getting something like that across the finish line is perhaps a little less far-fetched. But like I said, I'd be curious for Rich and for Marty's thoughts.
I'll just add that there are some ideas on the table that have bipartisan support, like, for example, infrastructure bank, some public-private partnerships in terms of, and tolling and things of that nature. So those things are on the table. The issue, speaking just on the surface transportation level, this has been for over at least 20 years, I'll say, this has been a struggle because the current revenue source, the gas tax, has been declining with greater efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And so, many people for a long time have said we need to totally rethink that and figure out a totally new way of financing our surface transportation projects. And by surface, that also includes rail in that bucket. And so there's a possibility that with a new Congress, new president, new thinking around how do we better finance this, whether it's the notion of the miles traveled, being assessed on miles traveled or something of that nature. There's potential for that. The other thing too, I'll say, is that it's not clear whether President Biden will put forward the infrastructure package as sort of a standalone or as part of kind of a economic stimulus package that I think he will seek once he comes into office. And if it's the latter, the economic stimulus package, it's possible that he may propose to finance infrastructure on a deficit spending level. And we've seen this past year that Congress has done a fair amount of that deficit spending in response to the COVID pandemic and its implications for our economy. So there is some potential, I would say, for some deals coming together. Perhaps with the change in government, there's a slightly better chance than in past years.
All right. And any other comments or thoughts from folks at Prime on this subject?
I would just add that part of it may come about as a result of they need to sell it better in the sense of how much you'll save if you improve the roads. The average driver is spending a lot of money getting his shocks and his struts and all the maintenance they have to do in their car when they, hit a manhole or hit, their potholes every day. And they'll save money over the long run if they improve these roads. And then, they have to sell it so that's a little bit of a salesmanship effort also has to be employed here to convince people that, yes, you may be paying a little bit more because we're doing a vehicle mileage as opposed to the gas tax, but in the long run, you are going to benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Paoni. And I'm going to tease my new colleague, Mr. Lee here by saying that was a gentle reminder on why it's so important that we see a VTA tax spending measure B program that it covers roads and repair, which I know he knows, but we had a long conversation about this topic just yesterday. The one other thing, going back to Ms. Hart-Thompson, that I would just ask to make sure we are informed about on the immigration front is the TPS program, which temporary protective status. You mentioned it in passing. I will just say it's a matter of interest and importance, and if you can make sure we stay informed about that as well. Last sort of big picture question, then I'm going to turn it over to Supervisor Lee, and it's this. Understanding that a lot will depend on the Senate results, President-elect Biden has made it a point during the campaign to talk about healing, time to come together, finding common ground. He, of course, is someone who has both gotten praise and some criticism for having worked across the aisle over the years. We have been through these changes in administration before, and I think we all remember when we were told in very plain language that Senate Republicans viewed their responsibility. Job one was to deter the president-elect then from getting work done. What's your, as old hands at all this, what's your sense of whether or not there's a hunger at all, or an interest even in the Congress to work in a way that's bipartisan, or whether we're going to have 6 months before everybody's at each other's throats yet again? I know it's a speculative question, but I'm just, I think as we're trying to figure out what the future looks like, it's sort of foundational.
I'll start and I'll let others chime in. You know, the President-elect Biden and Leader McConnell have a long track record of working closely together. You'll remember that it was a New Year's Eve weekend when the country was facing a fiscal cliff in 2012, that the two of them sat down and wrote a massive bill to avoid the fiscal cliff and solve a lot of problems. And there have been other instances of we're reminded of President-elect Biden back when he was in the Senate, working with then Senator Jesse Helms in the foreign policy arena to get some bipartisan deals. So I think there is a potential for it. Our society today, unfortunately, with social media and everyone knows everything instantly, maybe it's a little harder to form those bipartisan deals than that was even in 2012 or before that. But I do think that Vice President Biden has a track record of doing so. And I think the other thing too, looking at his cabinet selections too, with perhaps one exception, for the most part, the people he's tapping to fill out his cabinet, I think are appealing to the middle, right? So, Janet Yellen and others too, I think are viewed more as centrist. And I think looking at those cabinet players they too can work with Congress in cutting some deals. So you never know, but I think there's some hope that we'll have a more functional government next year.
Other thoughts?
Yes, I would just chime in that Senator McConnell is known for playing the long game. He had his conference call yesterday with his troops, and he recommended that nobody join Congressman Brooks when they count the electoral ballots in opposing the electoral ballots, because that would result in a immediate adjournment, going back to the Senate, 2 hours of debate, and a roll call vote on the objection. And he has 21 members up in 2022 to the 13 Democrats. And he even said, he told them that's not a vote that the class of 22 is going to want to take. And so McConnell will be looking at things through that prism of what do we need to do to get that class reelected and for him to maintain his majority leadership, should he be majority leader, or to take it if he's not. And he likes to often talk about, divided government can be very good for the economy. He's going to need some victories to show that, yes, they can govern and that they deserve to be reelected. And so, we'll see how that goes.
Mr. Paoni, that, however, also would suggest that if in his estimation, he being Leader McConnell, in his estimation, polarization or resistance is politically advantageous, then he moves in that direction.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, he'll move in whatever direction he thinks works for him. As he did with Garland, the Supreme Court justice, the unprecedented action there of ignoring that nomination. Spending $1.4 trillion on a tax cut that was unpaid for. They think that's going to benefit them. The more they'll go ahead and do it.
All right.
Et cetera.
We're running a little long, and that's on me. But let me turn to Supervisor Otto Lee. Supervisor, comments, questions for the team?
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. Thank you. When you mentioned that most of the team are pretty moderate, who would you say is probably the most On the left, is it Secretary Fudge? That's one you're thinking? That might be a bit more.
OMB.
OMB, yeah,
OMB.
yeah.
Hendon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She
If she
was,
gets confirmed.
yeah, she was, when I referenced the one, she was the one who I referenced as not being.
I see. Yeah. She was head of CAP, wasn't she?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
And a prolific tweeter,
Very much so indeed. Yes.
much to her demise right now.
Yeah.
I would
exactly.
I would also note, I think he'll be confirmed. I don't think that that Attorney General Becerra is viewed as a moderate, but I don't think that there are really very many moderate needles to thread on healthcare between the two parties for the most part. And I do think he'll be confirmed, but he's another one who I don't think is viewed as moderate.
Yes, remember the joke about Korea.
Yeah.
And yes, and General Lloyd Austin. I actually served under him. Well, we worked when we was in Iraq, 2009. Surprisingly, so surprising to see that name on that list there. But there was some issue regarding the civilian, the 7-year rule, right? That they have to overcome as well. Correct?
Yeah. That nomination rollout has not been perfect.
No.
And right. And that may be challenging. I know that, interestingly, Adam Smith, who's chairman of the House Armed Services, also raised some concerns about it. And I believe if you go back and look, I might get this wrong, were there 17 Democratic senators who didn't support, who for the same issue did not support was it 17 Democratic senators, Marty?
I'm not sure if it was 17 or 13, but it was
Okay.
a number of them.
Yeah.
And
It was not an insignificant number. So anyways, it sort of feels like OMB, maybe the sacrificial lamb, and DOD, maybe it's nothing more than rocky and still achievable, but it's definitely been bumpier than maybe they expected.
Got it.
Interestingly enough, that in order to get him confirmed, Congress will have to pass a piece of legislation allowing him to waive that 7-year requirement. And
Right.
that's what they did for Mattis. And for Mattis, the Republicans did a very good job of anticipating that they were going to need that vote. And so in the appropriations bill in December of 16, they put a provision in there stating that any bill that waives the Secretary of Defense requirement, and when it's considered in the Senate, would be subject to a 10-hour time limit, no amendments, and no filibuster. But that the final passage would still need 3/5, 60 votes. And that was included in the statute that was signed into law in December. And that's how they then passed that bill, and the House passed the bill also, allowing Mattis to become Secretary of Defense. So
Right.
they'll need to do something legislatively to allow Austin to take the job also.
Right. Back to the question on the House side, Elizabeth. You said 2 House seats still to be called. Last I saw, Christy Smith was still 333 votes behind. Is that one of the 2 House seats you're talking about, or there are 2 House seats elsewhere?
The 2 seats I was referring to were the Brindisi and Claudia Tenney race in New York. Maybe New York 27. And then I believe, Rich, there's still controversy, or at least the AP has not called an Iowa race.
The Iowa race has been certified by the Secretary of State, so that
Okay.
declared. There's some speculation that the Democratic candidate in that race may appeal to the House to overturn the results when they're seating members.
Got it. But the California race been called already, right? The 25th? Because that's certified, I thought, in California, correct? No?
That's my understanding, Supervisor, as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, on the Senate side, Mark Kelly already got sworn in because it was a special election, filling a seat. I guess the interesting thing is that depending on when Governor Newsom appoint, right, I am pretty sure the appointment would happen before the inauguration. Otherwise, there will be a one seat short in the Senate. Is that correct on the procedure, Marty?
Yes, I mean, obviously, she would, if they're going to appoint somebody to replace her before the inauguration, she would have to resign her seat early. So, I mean, my guess is he would appoint somebody and they would take their seat on January 21st.
Right. But that type of governor appointment, there's no legislative override. I mean, the California State Senate has no business. It's just the governor appoint and bam, that's it, right?
That's right. And then whoever gets appointed will be in office probably until the end of her term, unless you've got a different statute where they have to run for re-election at the next election.
Great, thank you. On legislative issue, I do remember, I remember vaguely hearing that the House passed a law to decriminalize marijuana early this year. I don't see the Senate having time to take it over. So is that bill basically die, have to start over again next legislative session?
Yeah, it's not going anywhere in the Senate.
Okay, all right, I figured not.
But I'll just add that the Senate did pass and the House passed this as well. There was a vote to make research around cannabis easier to do, and that passed both the House and Senate this recently.
But that still needs a presidential signature, and
yes, yeah. But it passed both chambers on voice votes.
On voice votes, okay, good. Actually, that's all the question I have. Thank you.
All right. Well, forgive me, I've conflated a couple of our items here, but I think at this point it would probably be timely to segue into the conversation about the implications of the changing administration and the dynamics in Congress with respect to healthcare. So if Mr. Margolin is still with us, why don't I ask him to lead off and then ask our friends at Prime to be ready with any other observations or thoughts they think might supplement that report. Mr. Margolin, you still with us?
I'm with you right here.
There you are. Thank you. You popped up on my screen.
Yes.
So what would you like to share with us?
So on healthcare, the first point I'd like to make relates to the deal that's being put together as we speak, this omnibus appropriations package and the COVID bill. There is one long-term health issue that may actually be resolved, at least for a few years, in the context of this deal, and that involves dish cuts that we've been facing for many, many years, $25–30 million of potential impact on Santa Clara County from these scheduled cuts in the disproportionate share hospital program. They've been deferred year by year for several years, this cut. And as a result of the deal on surprise billing, ironically enough, there now may be a sufficient pay for a way of funding it so that this cut can either be for a period of time eliminated and at a minimum deferred for, and maybe not just for 1 year. There's talk of it being for 3 to 4 years. So just worth noting that this surprise billing deal may actually have an impact on the county and this potential dish cut and defer that for multiple years. On the regulatory, administrative environment, legislative environment, as far as healthcare is concerned, obviously the Biden administration was planning, assuming during the campaign, to come in with a public option proposal and significant legislation to reform and improve upon the Affordable Care Act for reasons that Prime Policy has already outlined and you've already discussed. Either Republicans retain control, or if the Democrats pick up both seats, there's very, very narrow Democratic control. A bold or even a not bold legislative agenda on health, given how polarized people are on health, is very unlikely. Although I do want to make one comment to follow up on the comments made by Prime. I mean, it's definitely true that McConnell and Biden have a long history and relationship, but there's one other dynamic that's worth paying attention to, and that involves this so-called moderate caucus of senators who actually broke the impasse on the COVID relief bill. You may recall that bill was going nowhere. And then Manchin and Collins and Coons and several other senators who were in the middle, so Romney was part of that group, said, here's a $908 billion compromise package. And that led to the impasse being broken. And now we've got sort of the leadership negotiating the final details. But they did that by coming together on a bipartisan basis. So that could repeat itself on other issues in January, February, March going forward, just worth noting. As far as, and as Mr. Press already talked about in his report, there's obviously going to be a lot of work done to undo negative regulations put forward by the Trump administration on healthcare. A lot of undoing work to be done. There'll be new executive orders, new regulations to advance the Affordable Care Act, given the limitations on passing legislation. That's all important. But there's one particular area of administrative work involving health that we should all be reminded of, and that is our effort to extend our Medicaid waiver. As you know, Mr. Chair, and again, Supervisor Lee, you're new to this process, but we have a special arrangement with the federal government called a Medicaid waiver that has produced billions of dollars in Medicaid funding for California and hundreds of millions of dollars for Santa Clara County. It's expiring this December, our current waiver. There are 5-year agreements. This one's now expiring. The state's seeking an extension. They hope to get one from the Trump administration, a short-term extension. But in the end, we're going to be back into a negotiation over the longer-term provisions of how things like whole person care and global payment program. These are programs that provide additional supplemental Medicaid dollars to make sure that the uninsured, that people with chronic medical conditions get social services they need, things that Medicaid doesn't normally pay for, the waiver allows us to pay for. So that negotiation is going to go forward. And this goes back now to the point about Javier Becerra. We now have a Californian about to become potentially, again, there will be opposition from some in the Senate to his nomination. But again, his prime policy, I think, suggests that we all believe he's likely to be confirmed. And these waiver issues are very much within his bailiwick. If a Health and Human Services Secretary wants to weigh in on a waiver negotiation, they have the ability to do so within the limits of the policies and laws that regulate waivers. And we'll have an ally in Javier Becerra on overall funding for California's Medicaid system. That's worth noting as well. So those are initial comments, Mr. Chair. Happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Margolin. And let me just ask first, you mentioned public option as a Biden initiative and the suggestion that by virtue of the tight margins in the Congress, folks would understand that anything more ambitious or far-reaching might be a non-starter. I guess my question, and if the folks at Prime have a take on this as well, is will that in fact mean people stand down, or will it, will they feel that there's a need to simply continue to sort of push the agenda, because only by pushing do you make progress, is the argument. I struggle sometimes to sort through that dynamic as I watch from a distance.
So there definitely will be legislation introduced, and the House, as Prime indicated earlier on, may do a series of bills to kind of stake out their position on a wide range of issues. Again, message bills that may not have much chance of becoming law. And I have no doubt that there'll be a public option bill at some point in the process. There'll be single payer advocates once again putting forward their proposals. No one's going to back down from legislating. I'm really addressing what's likely to become law and what can actually be made real.
And is there a snowball's chance that a public option could become law if Republicans continue to hold control of the Senate?
I don't think so.
Okay. And your take, if any, we did hear from Prime earlier on California versus Texas. It wouldn't be a conversation with you, Mr. Margolin, if I didn't ask that.
Well, again, I agree with Mr. Press's assessment. He listened to the full hearing that we're likely to see the ACA survive given the questions asked by the Supreme Court justices. So I think we're likely to see it survive, but this is an odd time that we live in, and a very ideological, very factionalized world. And we have a new Supreme Court, and we have new members on that court, relatively new, a brand new member, and then a couple others that are relatively new. So we can't assume anything for sure until the court acts on the Texas case. But all indications are that they are not going to throw out the ACA. They may do some damage to it. It's a possibility, but throwing it out seems highly unlikely.
Do either you or Dr. Smith, if he is still with us in the meeting, have the ability to put a dollar amount on the significance of dish cuts for our county if we or escape another year or two here without action?
So I'll defer to Dr. Smith if he's still there, but my memory was that it was the risk was $25 to $30 million, but again, it's been deferred somewhat continuously, and I don't know if the county's if that still is the county's estimate on an annual basis if the cuts were to go through.
Supervisor, this is Miguel Marquez. Dr. Smith had to leave, and unfortunately, I don't know that number myself.
All right. If we could just ask at your convenience for that information, Mr. Marquez, just share it with the committee in an off-agenda report. It could even be a quick email. I don't want to make more work than is necessary, but this is an issue that, as Mr. Margolin seems to suggest, never quite goes off our agenda. So if we could, I'd just be helpful to know what the bottom line dollar implications are.
Mr. Chair, if I
please.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but
go right ahead.
Because in order to compress things a bit, I have one other sort of, you've really covered the COVID-19 package, relief package pretty thoroughly, but there's just one item that Mr. Mead actually made reference to earlier on that I'd like to raise again and just add an additional factor to, and that's the Provider Relief Fund, $35 billion that's currently being talked about. So again, we talk about how disappointed we are at the state and local dollars not being available. And Mr. Mead already referenced the fact that the county could benefit from things like the Provider Relief Fund. I do want to point out that, again, it's likely to be $35 billion nationally. And going back to Javier Becerra, the way at least the early language was drafted, there was going to be, and we'll see what the final deal is, substantial discretion given to the Health and Human Services Secretary in developing the formula for states to apply for this money. Santa Clara County has already gotten various sums of money from the earlier provider relief disbursements. And again, we need to focus on this new tranche of $35 billion, especially in the context of potentially our own Californian being the Health and Human Services Secretary.
Got it. Thank you. Supervisor Lee, comments, questions?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Bert, I understand the role of Prime. I just want to understand your role as well.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead, please.
So Prime Policy is the lead organization representing the county in Washington, and they have all the issue areas with the exception of healthcare. The county several years ago gave my firm, the Margolin Group, responsibility for advocacy on healthcare. I have a colleague, Angie Melton, who's not on the call today, who's in DC, who works with me on these federal healthcare issues.
Great. No,
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the quick question I have is, I think you've mentioned, assuming the Senate was able to turn the control, then there might be some discussion of the public option adding to the current ACA. Now, the question I actually have is more basic: is assuming the Supreme Court does not mess with the Affordable Care Act. Certainly, there's been legislation that's been passed to chip it away. How much of that do you think, with executive order, has been able to reinstate whatever ACA has been doing, has been chipped away at this point?
Well, there is work that can be done with executive orders. Certainly, there have been disincentives created for the Medicaid expansion. Lots of states that should have Medicaid expansion don't have it because the Trump administration established rules and parameters that made it uninviting for a lot of states. I have to say that because Governor Newsom in California have been so aggressive about implementing the ACA, not much of this we haven't been very much chipped away at. In fact, as you may know, the individual mandate was repealed by the Congress, and then Governor Newsom replaced it here in California. We have our own healthcare exchange covered California, been very aggressive and we actually provide subsidies above 400% of poverty. We provide additional supplemental subsidies beyond what the federal law requires. So I think that there are things that the Biden people will do with executive orders. They'll try to strengthen the ACA. A lot of that will apply to the states that have either not fully implemented it or have weak versions of it and would like more help. Not so much for California right now.
Right. Yeah. So we won't be affected as much, even though
not as much. I'm sure in some areas, but not as much.
Right. Good. That's great. And then the provider relief fund you mentioned, the 35 billions, assuming that would come through again, then obviously a billion here and billion there, that's a lot of money. So that's kind of divvied up kind of based on populations.
No, it's actually based upon that. It's actually been criticized very heavily for being not very transparent in terms of what the criteria. Originally, there was a formula based on net revenue, net Medicare revenue. They actually took it was net patient revenue. They took your net patient revenue and they gave in the first distribution last spring, it was distributed to hospitals based upon net patient revenue. So if you had a lot of net patient revenue, you got more money. If you had limited net patient revenue, less money. Then they proceeded to give money out to so-called hotspots where the COVID epidemic was especially burdensome. But how they defined a hotspot wasn't as clearly articulated as we would have hoped it to be. There wasn't a lot of transparency. There were a lot of complaints. So in this current package, the $35 billion package, there is apparently, we haven't seen it yet, going to be some language asking Health and Human Services Secretary to prioritize providers who have a high or a large Medicaid population so that they serve a low-income population. So in theory, the new criteria could generically benefit our system. But again, discretion will probably be given to the Health and Human Services Secretary to work out the final offering, and in the details, we may or may not benefit.
Got it. And does that funding usually go through the state to give to us, or does it go straight from federal government straight to the county?
It goes straight from the federal government to providers. So they create the formula, and then checks show up.
Great, awesome, good. Thank you very much, Ms. Margolin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Lee. And we're going to try and wrap up here in just a few minutes at 12 o'clock sharp. But let me turn to Prime again and see if there's anything else on the healthcare front that they would like to share with us to supplement or provide additional perspective on the topic.
I think Mr. Margolin has done a great job covering it, so nothing to add.
All right. Anyone else from Prime? If not, thanks, Mr. Peone, and thank you to the whole team at Prime. Thanks to Mr. Margolin. Thanks to staff. Mr. Marquez, anything else you want to raise, Ms. Christian, before we say that completes the final item, which is item number 8 and 9, and we'll consider those reports received?
Sure, Supervisor. Let me just add quickly, I did speak with Renee Santiago, who let me know we'll get the exact numbers for you by email and off agenda, but the number is somewhere in the $25 to $30 million range. And that number already is in the current fiscal year budget. So, the good news is we don't have another problem to address. The bad news is it's already baked into this year's budget. But we'll get to the exact numbers with that explanation off agenda. Thanks.
Thanks. And Ms. Marquez, when you say it's already baked into this year's agenda, that means we're counting on it, even though it's not yet 100% sure that it's happening, yes?
That's right. Budgets being our best assessment of a plan going forward. We plan to get it, so that's good news that we don't have to find those resources elsewhere.
All right.
If indeed it comes to pass.
Thank you. Then without objection and hearing none, we will.
My apologies for the interruption, sir. Mr. Pike does have his hand raised. I believe he wishes to speak.
Oh, thank you very much. Go right ahead.
Sure, and I'll make it quick. I know we want to get going. Just a couple of points. One, I did want to welcome Supervisor Lee. Good to see you. I was going to say we've not had much, no public events since March. I've had to stay out of the political realm, so it's good to finally see you again. I'll be in touch with your staff, and we'll be working together going forward. So great to see you again. Substantively, as always, it's very invaluable to hear the county's perspective on these federal issues. I will convey to Congressman Khanna and our team in strident terms that any delay in getting local COVID relief is a huge problem. That said, I know that they're aware of the concern, evidenced by the fact last night I saw Congressman Khanna on camera at about 10 p.m. And his frustration and concern was evident. So I can just confirm that our South Bay congressional delegation is on board and working hard to try to get some relief for the county. I would also underscore that our office will be searching for any potential for unwinding executive orders and actions through the legislative process. And if your team has any suggestions on that front, again, rather than having to go through the renewed rulemaking process with the Biden administration, if it can be done legislatively to do it quicker. If you have any suggestions, I'm sure you're already in touch with our DC team, but I'd be happy to facilitate on that or any other things that would help the county. So again, thanks very much. Very helpful for me.
Thank you, Mr. Pike. And I want to say thank you again, but ask our folks at the county, plus the folks at Prime, plus Mr. Margolin, to be mindful of your offer to have your office, Congressman Khanna's office, weigh in if there are opportunities. So we ought to try and find the opportunity to take advantage of that offer and interest. So thank you for that. My apologies, I did not see you on the screen earlier, or I would have introduced you. And I should let Supervisor Lee know, Representative Khanna and you in particular, as District Director, Ms. Pike, have been wonderful about participating in these meetings and being here to hear firsthand what our concerns are and carrying those back to Washington. So again, a shout out to both you and the Congressman, and thanks for that participation. And I think that means that we are now in a position to say without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all. Very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.